survived the jive.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you, everybody. Very nice to be here. On the story of, on the subject, I was asked to speak about something white pilling. So what I've tried to do is create a history lesson, but one that will hopefully give you all a good feeling, make you feel proud, and leave you feeling the right to hold your head up high. And it's rather in the spirit of the previous two talks. It carries on in much the same vein. So I'm telling a story, basically, about where British people and Europeans, but specifically British people, come from. So when you say you're an identitarian, you can have an idea of what it exactly is, in technical terms, historical and scientific, to be British. And this speech could only have been written in this month, this year, because several of the sources were only published this month. So it's the most up-to-date as of July 2019 that it could possibly be. And I have to construct it into a narrative, because whatever area you're in, storytelling is essential for human understanding. Whether you're in science or history, all facts need to be constructed into a narrative. That's how leftists use the term that's being used today for a group of people who we all know how to identify. That's how they have been so successful, by constructing narratives, often based on falsehoods. But those narratives are very powerful. And we need to have a narrative which is based on facts and truth, that we can understand ourselves and our place in history in relation to our ancestors and our future. So, of course, storytelling is essential to culture, to understanding, for human beings to understand, and that's why mythology was so important to our ancestors. The myths of heroes, of gods, these kinds of things. In the past, that's what served to instill us with a sense of purpose, identity, belonging, and reverence for the natural order. But today, we have to get our great stories from the BBC and from Hollywood movies, comic books and things like that, not always as good as what our ancestors had. Because the media and academia specifically are determined to rewrite a lot of our history so that it divorces us from any sense of belonging to our land and invalidates, therefore, any sense of hereditary achievement or entitlement. This has been achieved not only with a gradual but manufactured cultural shift towards neophilia, materialism, and hostility towards tradition, but also by appropriating our heroes, our ancestors, and our gods, and repurposing them in order to support a new materialist and globalist narrative of history. So not only, this includes also even modern cheap substitutes for heroes. James Bond. I'm not a big fan of James Bond, but it was okay. It was pretty good fun to watch James Bond. But that can't be allowed. James Bond has to be a black woman now. Even that. Oh, disabled. Maybe that's next. I wasn't aware of precisely the details of the new James Bond, the new 007. But it's also our ancient myths, as well as having been cheapened and replaced. Achilles, instead of Achilles and Hercules and Thor, we have instead, Superman or whatever, Spider-Man. But even now, the old ones have to be re-dug up and repurposed, sanitized. So Achilles is apparently black now, and Heimdall, the white, he's known as in Old Norse, Heimdall, the white god, is also black, and Thor is a woman. And they do this because these ancient European archetypes are potent and therefore threatening to them. And even in their diluted, commodified comic book hero form, they still pose a threat to the established order of the day. Every image of a strong European man is a threat, and will remain so in the face of an ideology which has to be inherently fragile as long as it opposes nature and what is natural. So it is this same agenda of misinformation that the media reports on the latest archaeological and scientific findings, genetic findings about our past, the same spirit with which the world of fiction and Hollywood rewrites things. they have to present the facts of genetic findings, particularly about ancient Europeans. And these are the ones I want to re-present to you in a more, in basic terms, without any dressing up, without any propaganda, the reality of the history of Europe and the peoples who have populated it. Because significant breakthroughs in genetic science at the moment are actually vindicating the great work of European scholars of old who invented the fields of archaeology. The first proper archaeologist was a Dane, and the historical method itself, and modern linguistics. The Indo-European languages were identified by a Welshman. He was the first one to realize that this ancient language family existed. And these, historians in the Victorian times came up with a bunch of theories about migrations of mankind and the origins of people, which were widely accepted as fact, until after the Second World War, everything had to be re-examined. People had to be a bit more skeptical, and these were seen as maybe jingoistic. Perhaps they were influenced by colonialist narratives or mentalities, bigotry, and instead we have new narrative of history where the overarching connection of the different types, races of man, has been the desire for peaceful trade, not invasions, not migrations, not invasions. But the older historians are being validated by more recent science, and I'll get to that in a bit. But first, let's go right back to the very oldest of mankind. So Grecopithecus freybergi is a hominid dated to 7.2 million years ago, recently dated, but it was actually dug up a long time ago, back in 1944, by the Nazis, and they found it in Greece. So it's the oldest direct ancestor of humans, excluding the chimpanzee lineage, or alternatively, it may be the last common ancestor of both chimpanzees and human beings. But it lived in Europe, which is interesting, because it may mean that the primitive human-like creatures from which humans evolved themselves migrated into Africa before migrating out. Now, some people I know don't like the out of Africa theory. Some people would like it not to be true. I would say that most of our ancestry does come from migration out of Africa, but it doesn't really make a difference to me. It makes no more difference to me whether they migrated out of Africa, whether their ancestors migrated into Africa from Europe, or whichever beach the first amphibian crawled off out of the water. It doesn't matter if that beach happened to be in Europe or Africa. It's really so long ago that it's quite irrelevant to identity politics now. And anyone who attempts to use stuff that happened in the Paleolithic or beyond even to justify immigration or even to oppose it is just being ridiculous. It's got no relevance at all to the immigration debate today. And anyone who tries to use it that way is trying to hoodwink you. So the date of the first modern humans, that's like us, to come to Europe has also been pushed back this month by more than 150,000 years, which entirely makes us reassess the origins of man. But a fossil has been found also in Greece, and it indicates that humans first left Africa over 200,000 years ago. And that's the oldest human fossil found outside Africa. Now, that doesn't mean that we descend from that migration out of Africa. In fact, we definitely don't. We know that there was a migration out of Africa within the last 80,000 years from which all non-Africans descend. But the inevitability of the success of human beings can be disproven by the fact that there was a previous migration out of Africa into Europe that failed, that went extinct. And the Neanderthals, who had already been there before, continue to live there. So I suspect perhaps the Neanderthals got rid of the first load of humans that came. So these second wave from which we descend, as I said, came in the last 100,000 years, and they actually interbred with Neanderthals. And this is one of the things that contributed to the biodiversity of humankind. All non-African human beings, or by African I mean sub-Saharan African, I'm not talking about North Africans, Middle Eastern, who are basically Middle Easterners. But all non-sub-Saharan Africans have some Neanderthal DNA, because the interbreeding with Neanderthals happened quite soon after that second migration out of Africa. And then they diverged. The humans populated the entire Eurasian continent. The ones who went west became Europeans. The ones who went east interbred with yet more different species. Denisovans, for one. Some people in Papua New Guinea can have as much as 14% non-human DNA, including the Neanderthal and Denisovan put together. But there are also signals of other populations besides Denisovans who have not yet been identified in the fossil records, only through genetics and what they're calling ghost populations. At the moment, that means that non-Africans have admixture from at least 3 different species, but there's going to be a lot more turn up later on. This is early days. They're only just finding out about these things. And also, the humans that stayed in Africa are not pure humans either. They interbred with other species. In fact, there was a great diversity of human species within Africa, and most of the diversity within the human race today exists within Africa, which makes the idea of a black race absolutely absurd when you realize that, within the group we call Black Africans exists more diversity than there is between a Japanese person and a Welsh person. Some physical traits of modern Europeans already existed in Neanderthals. And this means, this is talking like 45,000 years ago. There were, or more of these traits are very old, including some genes associated with complexion, for example. So the idea that white skin is a very recent thing is not true. The genes have been around for a long time, but they may not always have been prevalent in Europe at all times. Early modern humans in the Paleolithic, the first main ones to come after Neanderthals, the cultures archaeologically known as the Aurignacians and the Gravettians. And what's been discovered, these were determined by archaeological differences in the material culture. But now from genetics, we can also see that there weren't just different types of tools, there were different peoples. That means another load of people came and replaced the previous people. And we can't prove that was with violence, but my tendency is always to assume violence because that's what human beings are like. But these upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, they didn't actually contribute a lot to us. Even though we're talking, within the last 45,000 years now, in recent history, I still don't feel like it's that relevant to us because we didn't actually get much of our DNA from these early European hunter-gatherers. If you want to understand why, I should let you know that current estimates for the entire population of all of Western and Central Europe during parts of the Paleolithic, so all of the Western, all of Central Europe is at maximum 3,000 people. So you're talking like less than one village now. Like 3,000 people is very small for a village. So it's not a lot of people. It's not very important in terms of our identity now. But then the next load of hunter-gatherers came in the Mesolithic, called the Western hunter-gatherers. And we do have DNA from them. And these are people who came and replaced the previous ones also. You can speculate on why. One of them was very famously the debate at the beginning of 2018. He made the news, Cheddar Man. He belonged to this race of people. And all of them had blue eyes. They have Labrana Man was found in Spain. There's Cheddar Man in Britain. There's a few Mesolithic hunter-gatherers across Western Europe, and they're all very closely related. There wasn't as much diversity in Europe at that time. These people don't have the genes we now associate with our current complexions. So that led people to think perhaps it's quite likely they had a darker complexion than us, but they all had blue eyes uniformly. The closest living relatives to these people are modern Europeans. In fact, Northern Europeans are much more closely related to Mesolithic hunter-gatherers than Southern Europeans. So the idea that we identify modern populations, kinship with this population based on a projected complexion is nonsense. It's nonsense. And that's what Afua Hirsch and people were doing, saying that the first Britons were black. Well, they weren't. Black means sub-Saharan African. They simply weren't sub-Saharan Africans. They were definitely what we would call European in their genetics. They're very closely related to us, and also in their general skull morphology, and of course their eyes and things and their hair, regardless of their complexion. And in fact, that general morphology that we call Caucasoid, if you want to group the earliest form of taxonomy of human peoples, from Carl Linnaeus, was grouping them into 3 general groups. And the one that we call Caucasoid is quite clearly much older than the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. Even the Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, who we have little relation to, that lived in Europe before, are, broadly speaking, Caucasoid, and that you're talking tens of thousands of years ago. So it's a very old type of human being, the European type. Nevertheless, we're not quite the same as these Mesolithic hunter-gatherer ancestors of ours. It's more significant from my perspective, and I would argue for all of you, the people who came later, the Bronze Age conquerors and beyond. So, as I said, the DNA evidence is vindicating these ancient narratives of conquerors, like the Indo-Europeans, like the Anglo-Saxons, like the Vikings. And even though it's politically incorrect, it can't be denied, and even liberal scientists are, admitting this stuff is all correct. It was all right the first time. So the next invasion after Cheddarman's people was the Neolithic invasion of people from Anatolia. And once you have them mixing with the Neolithic farmers, they bring farming in the Neolithic, you have a basically modern European, a Sardinian. Modern day Sardinians are pretty much exactly the same as those Neolithic human beings, Neolithic Europeans. And Stonehenge was built by such people, and they are our ancestors. About 9% of our British DNA today comes from the Neolithic peoples of Britain. It's quite significant. But we have a lot more, maybe nearly half our DNA comes from Neolithic Europeans in general, but more from Germany and Poland rather than the ones that lived in Britain, because a new people came 4,500 years ago who replaced the Neolithic peoples. They were larger, stronger, more robustly built in their skeletons, very broad-skulled. They had horses, which had been domesticated on the steppe, and they carried, as well as horses with them, they carried diseases that originated on the steppes and DNA from the Russian steppes. So these people brought in a lot of Russian DNA, and that is what we are today, the same as them genetically. They were warlike. They had far more advanced forms of metallurgy than previously existed in Europe. And they brought the languages that we speak today, the Indo-European languages. Even English now shares many words of direct descent from these languages spoken in Russia 8,000 years ago or more. And they were brought into Britain 4,500 years ago. A lot of stuff has happened since that time, 4,500 years ago. I don't like to pretend that it's all stayed the same. But you should remember that genetically, these people 4,500 years ago looked the same as us. If you were to put them on a principal component analysis chart, which shows you like the groupings of the genetic types of people in Europe, they plot the same as modern British people. The same. They are very, very much the same as us in every respect, and we are direct descendants of them. Yet there have been subsequent migrations into Britain. So why is it that we're still the same as the people 4,500 years ago? I'll get into it. So since that time, 4,500 years ago, we've subsequently adopted Celtic languages, which emerged from Central Europe, somewhere around Austria or Czech Republic region, about sometime in the Iron Age, and then we endured Roman occupation, and our blood was then finally, in the migration age, mixed with our Germanic cousins of the continent, who came from the same stock as us. That is the Bell Beaker culture. Those people that came 4,500 years ago are called the Bell Beaker people of the Lower Rhine area. I should specify that Bell Beaker culture is an archaeological culture identified by its material culture, but genetics shows that the Bell Beaker culture in Spain is a different people from the people of the Lower Rhine, so people in Holland basically. The Lower Rhine Bell Beaker culture gave birth to the Celtic peoples and the Germanic peoples. They all derived from this. So when the Germanic invasions happened at the Anglo-Saxon times, they were just separated by a couple of thousand years of divergence. They're very closely related. And culturally, they were very similar too. So we took a Germanic language and we began worshipping Germanic gods for a couple of centuries before we returned to the same Christian God our Celtic forebears had took up centuries earlier. Our nation grew in wealth and power, and our seafaring skills also. Ingenuity, determination, and power of our ancestors and a spirit of adventure led them to map out the far corners of the earth, and we claimed much of it as our own in the colonial era. For many races, the first knowledge of a world outside their own was the British, the arrival of the British. Our name and our flag were, during the colonial era, and are still today, known by pretty much every human being on the planet, now a population of billions of people. And that is testament to the achievements of our ancestors too. We went so far and we met so many peoples, but we are genetically scarcely different to those ancestors of ours who trod the same sacred green land of ours over 4 millennia ago. Until very recently, the only people to have significantly altered the DNA of the British Isles since the late Neolithic Bell Beaker invasions were those two invasions of Germanic peoples, the Anglo-Saxons and then the Vikings. Now, the media want you to think of the Beaker folk as being foreigners of strange Russian origin, and the Stonehenge builders, who were genetically like modern Europeans anyway, of southern Europe, they want to say they're Turks because Anatolia was technically in Turkey, but of course, Turks are a different thing from subsequent historical events. They wanted you to think the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers are African because they may have had darker complexions. They wanted to think of your ancestors as foreign, and the idea is that you have no more right to this land than anybody. It's a trick, of course, and they are manipulating facts, stretching the facts. The best lies contain an element of truth, someone said earlier today. In each case, a little research scratches away the false surface and reveals the lies for what they are. The Beaker folk were like us. The Anglo-Saxons did not come here asking for anything as economic migrants. They won this land by the sword, and the Britons fought back against them. There is no parallel between our noble forebears and the ignoble motivations of those arriving today with palms out, expecting charity, or those who enable their passage while muzzling those who dare oppose it. A study in 2015 showed that 10 to 40% of English DNA comes from the Anglo-Saxons. It's hard to distinguish that from Danish DNA because it's from pretty much the same region and the same origins. So the Viking DNA is very similar to the Anglo-Saxon one. And earlier this month, a new preprint for a paper titled The Population Genomics of the Viking World revealed a few more very interesting facts. It revealed that the British Vikings were mainly from Denmark, but Norwegians contributed about 4% to our DNA, and the Danes presumably somewhere between 4 and 16%, hard to tell because you can't tell what's Anglo-Saxon. But if we combine that with the other previous statement of us being 10 to 40% Anglo-Saxon, it might be that we're as much as 50% Nordic Germanic and 50% Brythonic. Hard to tell, and it's also regionally dependent because it's not uniform within Britain. But we left our marks on the Nordics too. The study found 12 to 25% British DNA in Norway. So we got that too. And it should be mentioned when people project the modern narratives of migration onto the past and consider them equivalent, that the Anglo-Saxons were not welcome by the Celts, and the Vikings were not welcomed by the Anglo-Saxons. The history of Northern Europe is one of land conflicts between closely related peoples who were happy to slaughter one another to defend their lands. It was also revealed this month by the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History that a terrible plague swept the late Roman Empire and affected Britain. It first struck in 541 AD, that's just around the time the Anglo-Saxons are coming, and returned in multiple waves until 750. So that might explain why the Germanic people were so successful in replacing the Romanized Celts who had been here before. There may have been a plague that just got rid of a lot of them. There's no evidence of mass genocide or war, but absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, of course. Now, these events tell the entire story of our people and how we came to be as we are today. There were subsequent movements into Britain. That is true. But they did not make a significant impact on our genetics or our culture. I can go into this. These kind of subversive historians like to bring up the Elizabethan era and talk about the diversity of port towns especially. It's true that they thronged with foreigners, traders, of course. Ports generally do, don't they? There were even some blackamoors, which is the term used in Elizabethan England to describe dark-skinned Muslims from North Africa, and also black people. The distinction we make between black people and Middle Eastern people is a modern one. It's not something that people understood then. The word Turk, for example, meant Arab, and could also mean people from the Maghreb. And blackamoor just means a dark-skinned Arab or a black person. And there were some here, which is something that the left love to accentuate and exaggerate for their own nefarious purposes. By 1530, the population of England and Wales had risen to around 3 million. And by 1600, it was about 4 million. That's an enormous rise. That's more than double what it had been in 1066. So over the entire period between 1500 and 1640, the most left-wing historian will not claim that there could be more than 360 blackamoors living in the entire British Isles, right? So that's 140 years, 360 people. I don't know how those are distributed over that time, but let's say there are about a dozen at any one time. A dozen, 12 people out of 4 million people. And they don't stop talking about them like it was such a vital part of our history. 12 people. It's hardly worth mentioning, except actually some people at the time did mention them, otherwise we wouldn't know. And what did they mention them in what context? They wanted to get rid of them. However, this number of 12 was far too much for them. In 1596, a merchant named Van Senden was authorized in a letter from the Privy Council to deport the blackamoors to Iberia. But the masters of the blacks, who kept them as servants, did not want to lose their black servants. Of course, servants and slaves are different things. Van Senden was opposed by the masters, and so he asked the Queen for the power to deport the blackamoors without, and I quote, the interruption of their masters or any other persons. He was quite committed to this. However, he failed to achieve it. So actually, there weren't any deportations. It's not true that they were deported. So he had to tolerate the presence of 12 people in the nation of 4 million. Whatever his reasons for wanting these people expelled, we can see today that those servants contributed nothing to the genetics of modern Britain and are overemphasized by left-wing propagandists like the BBC to justify the multicultural experiment we now endure. With the Industrial Revolution, the population of Britain exploded again. By 1800, there were over 9 million people on this island. Now, even though a lot of workers were coming from Europe, and they came in much larger numbers now we get into the industrial era, in the 18th and 19th centuries, their numbers still paled in comparison to those of the natives, because even though we had more immigrants, we also had more of us. So we exploded in a way that no human population ever had, because we're the first industrialized nation. So the records of that time show about, for example, give Italians, about 245 Italians migrated to Britain per year between 1800 and 1945. So that sounds like quite a lot. That's, several thousand, but it's, when you're talking about when the population's in, excess of 9 million, it's still peanuts. So larger numbers, some people will know about the Huguenots. The Huguenots often brought up as evidence of, how successful migration and integration can be. Well, let's look at that. Well, they arrived in the 18th century, about 50,000 of them, and they settled mainly in East London. They were genetically very similar to the English, so it's not really easy for us to distinguish their, DNA in the modern populations. And of course, they were Protestants like everyone else, so there was no religious conflict, and they just integrated quite quickly. Did well in the textile industry. So you could say it's an example of successful multiculturalism in historical Britain, but with the caveat that it was a comparatively small number, the same religion, and racially indistinguishable. If you'll allow me to use the word racial, I know it's not popular now. A number of genetic studies have concluded that the genetic impact of immigration to Britain since 1066 has been very small. The native British population genetics is typified by stability, not by flux, not by change, like some parts of the world. Despite being the first industrialized nation in the world and experiencing such enormous population growth, we remain among the least inbred peoples on Earth. We're rivaled only by other neighboring Northern European peoples. The only turbulent introductions of new blood to these islands since the Neolithic have been from close cousins, Germanic speakers from the continent who descended from the same Beaker folk, as I said. And the history of Britain is one of remarkable homogeneity, which contrasts starkly with the global influence that our nation has had. The entire world has aped our science, our engineering, our systems of government, of law. They have yielded to our superior military strength and strategy and adopted many of our customs, aspects of our culture that we can hardly recognize them as British. They seem so perennial. They have marveled at our science. In 1665, two fellows of the Royal Society presented the first published depiction of a microorganism, which they discovered with simple microscopes. germs, as we know, were finally understood, and mankind could move forward in terms of medicine in a way that would never have been possible otherwise. The following year, Isaac Newton was the first to describe and identify the force of gravity. A century later, oxygen itself was discovered and described by the Yorkshireman Joseph Priestley. We built the first steam engine in 1801, and the ancient technology of the Romans, the genius that built the dome of the Pantheon, cement, had been lost to humanity for about 1,000 years until a bricklayer in Leeds, Joseph Aspdin, he reinvented it with a very similar method that the Romans had used. The telephone, invented by a Brit, 1876, Alexander Graham Bell. TV in 1925 by John Logie Baird. Even the World Wide Web, 1989 by Tim Berners-Lee. If the story of this little island and its extraordinary people were to be written as a work of fiction, people would find it too unbelievable. It's too outlandish, too extraordinary. A race of northern barbarians scorned by the first civilized nations of the world, those in the Mediterranean, but destined to inherit the world and change the course of history forever. No matter what lies our enemies will tell about us, no matter how much hate and vitriol they spit at us through clenched teeth, no matter how many demands they make that we give up our heritage and our claims of our ancestral rights, no matter how much they say we have no right to pride and patriotism, we can all be certain of one thing. They will say all of this in our native language. God save the Queen, and thank you for watching.